vote for Scott's family. I don't want to be driving to the.
Okay. Okay. We are a small but mighty group tonight. So thank you for coming. Today is democracy, about democracy, then and now. The first problem in talking about democracy is the question of a definition. What in the world is it? Etymologically, it means the rule of the people. But which people? How many of them? What powers do they exercise? In what fashion do they exercise these powers? About all of this, there has been endless debate. Maybe we know democracy best by what it is not. It is not monarchy, it is not dictatorship, it is not aristocracy, it is not autocracy, it is aimed at preventing tyranny. I've sometimes thought that Winston Churchill had it right when he said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. Now, what I want to do today is to walk you through some of the various forms that democracy has taken in the course of human experience, and then a bit more about the ups and downs of democracy in more recent times, especially in the 20th and 21st century. Now, democracies are usually associated with states, with human societies that are organized around states that have a formal government. But states are not the only way to organize human societies. In fact, they're only about 5,000 or 6,000 years old, and for most of human history, people lived in societies that had no states. And so in those societies, mostly small scale, they learned to perform the functions of government without the apparatus of government. They were embodied in small-scale decentralized societies where mutual consent and voluntary compliance were the rule. An example of a society what's happening here? There. Some of you may have read the famous novel by Chinua Achebe called Things Fall Apart. He's a Nigerian writer, and he wrote this novel, I think somewhere around 1960, in which he described in novelistic form the way in which the Igbo people, his people, governed themselves. Despite the fact that they lived next door to a number of societies or small states, they boasted that the Igbo have no king. Rather, they relied on a variety of informal societies, women's associations, a balance of power among various kinship groups, ritual experts as mediators of disputes. So these small-scale societies, like the Igbo, were what you might call democracies by default. There was no state. So the default condition was that they were essentially democratic, that the people ruled themselves. Now, the kinds of democracy that we know about are associated with states. But as I said, states are only about 5,000 or 6,000 years old, maybe 3,000 BCE. When these states began to emerge, in Mesopotamia in particular, they were generally headed by monarchs. But there was also frequently a kind of assembly that was associated with these. These were public assemblies where ordinary people debated and decided on the rules for their society without being dictated to by a ruler. Now, we frequently associate this, what I'm referring to as assembly democracy, is usually associated with Athens, and more about that in a minute. But it's really much older than Athens. These kind of public assemblies began with some of these early states around 2500 BCE. These cities usually had a monarch, but he was not an absolute monarch. The monarch was constrained and influenced by these public assemblies. In fact, there's a famous text from the city of Nineveh in which warned rulers to stop monkeying around with the freedom of the city, to stop taking silver from people, and to begin to treat lawsuits more seriously than they had. So this kind of assembly democracy spread from the Middle East, east toward India, and west toward the Mediterranean world. And so we pick up the story in Athens around 500 BC. Athens was a city then of around 30,000 people, with another 10,000 foreigners living in the city. And it is the primary exemplar of this kind of assembly democracy. The assembly, the assembly often met in the agora. This is the ruins of the agora in Athens. It was a gathering space, an open air gathering space. And the people who met here were citizens of Athens. They believed that Athens was a democracy, that it was owned collectively, not just by prominent men, but by carpenters, shipbuilders, farmers, sailors, blacksmiths, and so forth. When the assembly met, they decided on the laws for the city, and every citizen who came could have his say. There were no parties, there were no elections, even voting was suspect. The goal of this assembly democracy was consensus through debate, that by everybody speaking, having a debate, that they could arrive at a consensus that would then be implemented in the city. They also had another interesting check against a tyrant or a dictator. It was the practice of ostracism. Every year, the assembly voted on whether there were any people who should be ostracized. To be ostracized meant that you were banished from Athens for 10 years. And so this was a kind of a check on troublemakers or people who might seek to assert a more dictatorial authority. So Athens was a citizenship of was a democracy of citizens, but there were limitations. Women were one of them. No women could vote, which is kind of ironic because the goddess named Demokratia was a female. So a female figure in Greek mythology represented democracy, even though women were not able to take part in public debate. Neither were slaves. Athens was a slave-based society. About a third of the population of Athens were slaves. And of course, they were not citizens, so they could not take part in public life. And so here's another irony, is that slavery and democracy grew up together in Athens at the same time. Slavery expanded and male democracy expanded, which is perhaps not so different from the beginning of our own democracy. Now, democracy in Athens had its opponents. People thought that it simply gave power to the ignorant and the self-centered. One foreign observer said, "I find it astonishing that here in Athens, wise men speak on public affairs, but fools decide them." The fools were the people who were in the assembly. Furthermore, Plato was no friend of democracy. He thought that it led to mob rule, and he was especially offended that it was the assembly who had ordered the execution of Socrates, his mentor, for undermining the virtue of the young people of the city. Now, Athenian democracy, although it's widely celebrated in the Western world, was really very brief, about 150 years. By the time that Greece was taken over and conquered by Macedonia and Alexander the Great came to power, that kind of democracy was largely over. But we will not let it die. And Western civilization has continuously sought to revive Western democracy and, frankly, all things Greek. Okay, nonetheless, assembly democracy persisted for a long time in a number of other places. Around 1200 or so, a new form of democracy began to emerge in the Atlantic world. It is what we might refer to as electoral democracy. And it meant self-government based on the election of officials who held office and governed on behalf of the people, but temporarily. It is associated with parliaments, with written constitutions, with political parties, with elections, with polling places, and of course with voting. Now, assembly democracy aimed at unanimity and consensus. Electoral democracy did not. Electoral democracy.
Majority. When you say electoral democracy, you're only referring to the European countries, right?
Well, that's where it started. Yes, yes. It actually got started in a small way in first Spain and then England. And from about 1200 on, it was primarily a phenomenon of the Western world and North America. Now, later, of course, it spread more globally. Now, electoral democracy was an adaptation to larger societies. When you're talking about a country like Spain or England, you can hardly expect a public assembly. Questions of population density and distance, of course, made that quite impractical. Now, oh yes, here I go. This is Plato. I sort of got excited and forgot about my slide here. Plato said, "So tyranny naturally arises out of democracy, and the most aggravated form of tyranny and slavery out of the most extreme forms of liberty." So this is one of the long-time critiques of democracy, is that it can give rise to tyranny. Now, the kind of electoral democracy that became much more prominent in the Western world began actually in Spain in 1188 and England around 1215. What happened was that these kings ran out of money for the wars they were undertaking. And so they found it expedient to call together representatives of the major groups in society. In Europe of the Middle Ages, these were referred to as estates. The first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the nobility, the third estate were really everybody else, although it was primarily leading urban merchants. These were the three estates. And so here you see images of the rulers of both Spain and England calling together representatives from these estates in order to raise money. They did not represent the people generally, but they represented rather these particular established groups in society. During the so-called Age of Enlightenment, largely in the 18th century, a number of European thinkers of the Enlightenment began to lay the philosophical foundations for this electoral democracy. John Locke declared that governments exist by the consent of the people, not by the divine right of kings. Montesquieu emphasized the separation of powers within a democracy to prevent tyranny. Rousseau argued that sovereignty rests with the people, not with parliaments, not with monarchs, but the sovereignty of a state rests with its people. Now, the American Revolution sought to put all of this into practice and is famous for doing so probably for the first time. I don't know if you've been watching Ken Burns.
Yeah,
But
fascinating.
it's an extended story about how an extended story full of irony and setbacks, but it is about this process of which electoral democracy was established in the United States with a constitution, and it was a representative democracy based on elections and with various checks and balances. The French Revolution solidified this kind of electoral democracy. It gave expression to the idea of universal rights, to the legal equality of all people, to constitutions as the foundation for electoral democracy. But the French Revolution also showed how democracy could lead to terror and to dictatorship. Napoleon came to power as an antidote to the instability of French democracy in the late 19th century. So by 1914, by the beginning of the First World War, there were a few electoral democracies in the world. In Australia and New Zealand, in France, in Great Britain, in the United States. Germany had a parliament, to be sure, but it was largely ruled by the emperor and traditional landowning elites. Russia got a parliament finally in 1905, although it didn't have much power. The Chinese overthrew their emperor in 1912, but what took its place was not really so much democracy, but a military dictatorship under the control of Chiang Kai-shek. Now, a third kind of democracy that emerged, at least in theory and to some extent in practice, by the end of the 19th century is what we might call social democracy. It evolved from the movement of the industrial working class movement and was informed by the ideas of Karl Marx. I'm sure many of you have probably read the Communist Manifesto and other writings by Marx. But the basic idea that Marx had is that political democracy was not enough, especially in a capitalist society characterized by extreme inequality in wealth and social position. And so the whole argument was that society needed to be democratized, not just voting. The social structure needed to be democratized, wealth needed to be democratized and redistributed more widely in the population, not just voting. Now, Marx himself never believed that this could happen without revolution. He thought that the industrial bourgeoisie had such a firm control of the state that it would never give up its power, and that it was not really susceptible to reform. About this, Marx was wrong. And by the end of the 19th century, many socialists began to argue that social democracy could come about through the democratic process, through elections, through the influence of trade unions, through the welfare state, through economic redistribution. It could, a kind of social democracy could take hold. And to some extent, it did. It did. And there are elements of social democracy, even here, where socialism is a bad word, at least until we have elected a mayor, a socialist Muslim mayor of New York City. So there is hope.
Trump's buddy.
The exemplar, of course, of this kind of democratic socialism has been found in the Scandinavian states. And it is based on fairly high taxes, but also spending for free education, for healthcare, for various welfare schemes. And of course, we have elements of that here, although no one wants to call it socialism. You know, Social Security is a kind of socialism, Medicare is a kind of socialism, and there are others. Now, the communist revolutions in Russia, China, Vietnam, Cuba, and elsewhere acted on this socialist agenda, but in doing so, largely dispensed with political democracy. So the communist states here, this is a Soviet poster from 1964, let us close ranks and move toward communism. They claim to be democratic because in their view, the state or the Communist Party was acting in the interests of the people. But any kind of formal democracy, multiple parties, regular elections, and so forth, was out the window. Now, turning to the last century or the last 120 years or so, democracy had a number of ups and downs. After World War I, there was an extension of democracy. Male suffrage, male voting had largely been achieved in, of course, in the United States and in Western Europe. But women's suffrage only came about after the First World War. Here, it was not until 1920. In France, it didn't occur until 1945, actually. Furthermore, new democracies evolved as old empires diminished, and Germany became a democracy during the Weimar Republic. Turkey became a democracy. Poland, Czechoslovakia, these new countries that emerged after World War I began, at any rate, with an element of democracy. Now, in the 1930s and 40s, much of this was wiped out by the spread of either fascism or communism. Although both the fascists and the communists claimed to be democratic in the sense that they were working toward the betterment of the people as they defined it. Now, after World War II, democracy was restored to Japan, to Germany. The Allied victory in World War II affirmed democratic principles, and they were enshrined in the principles of the United Nations. This came from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that the UN passed, I think it was in 1948. Eleanor Roosevelt had a lot to do with writing it. Everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country directly or through freely chosen representatives. This is an affirmation by the UN of what we are calling electoral democracy. Electoral democracy also got a boost through the decolonization effort. As you probably know, from about the 1940s through the 1960s or early 70s, there was a wave of the dissolution of European colonial empires in Asia and Africa. And dozens of new countries emerged. most of them, at least initially, with a democratic constitution. The British and the French tried to construct democracies in the colonies as they were leaving. And democracy was now claimed as a universal right, no longer simply a Western or a European thing, but the heritage of mankind. Now, among these new democracies in the developing world, in the former colonies, India has probably been the most successful. It has had regular elections, it has had peaceful transfers of power, it has had multiple parties since independence. Although there is some question these days about the state of democracy in India. Elsewhere, however, democracy did not last so long. And the big success of democracy, of course, was when South Africa threw off white rule in 1994, and Mandela voted, and there were these huge lines of people that you see in the insert slide there that gave cause for great celebration, that here was a place that democracy was making a real inroad. Now, in most African countries, however, that emerged as democracies when they initially became independent, within 10 years or so, most of this had sort of been swept away largely by military coups or replaced by one-party states or strong-man autocratic governments. And a similar wave of military governments took shape all over Latin America in the 1960s and 70s. This brings us to what is sometimes called the third wave of democracy. In the late 70s, through the early 20th century, through the early 21st century, there was a phenomenon that we can call the globalization of democracy. There was a global wave of democratic reform. In the first place, there was the end of military rule in Spain, Portugal, and Greece. There was a return to democracy in most Latin American countries and many African countries. A number of authoritarian Asian states transitioned to some form of democracy: South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia. And of course, in 2011, we had the so-called Arab Spring, where a number of Arab countries were apparently beginning a transition to democracy. This marked a high point in global democratic politics. It was seen now increasingly as a universal thing, the heritage of mankind, not just European, and it was available everywhere and anywhere as a vehicle for protest and as the best hope for a better world. This globalization of democracy was underpinned by the growth of what we call civil society, which refers to voluntary groups of people not run by the state. Disaffected students, professionals, urban workers, environmental groups, women's groups, environmental groups, all of which now began to use social media to mobilize their followers and to press for democracy. And so by the early 21st century, many people began to see democracy as globally triumphant. And one of the major steps in that is the collapse of the Soviet Union and of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe. As you remember, many of us are old enough to have witnessed this. In 1989, the so-called miracle year, all of the Eastern European satellites threw off their Communist Party rule. And in 1991, of course, the Soviet Union itself disintegrated into 15 new separate states. And many of them claimed democracy as what they were aiming at. They wanted to be more Western. They wanted to join the democratic societies of the world. All of this was given a kind of classic form in, I forget if it was a book or an article by a fellow named Francis Fukuyama, and it was titled The End of History. Fukuyama argued that all of these things that I have just outlined meant that, in his view, history was ending. Not literally, but that Western democracy was the final form of human government. And all of these things, this globalization of democracy, had demonstrated that to be the case. Perhaps, however, they spoke too soon. Because what has been occurring in the 21st century illustrates the fragility, vulnerability, the uncertainty of democracy. Oh, well, here. This is the fall of the Berlin Wall. This is the end of the Soviet Union. But long ago, John Adams said something like this: "Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There was never a democracy yet that did not commit suicide." And so the question that I want to end this with is this where we are? Are we witnessing this today? There are any number of examples of what has been called democratic reversal or democratic backsliding. For example, many elected leaders, once in office, turned authoritarian. Chavez in Venezuela, Putin in Russia, Erdogan in Turkey, Bolsonaro in Brazil, El Sisi in Egypt, and Trump in this country. In Hungary and Poland, right-wing movements had shifted politics into a much more authoritarian direction. There were 8 military takeovers in West and Central Africa between 2020 and 2023. China famously cracked down on a democracy movement there in 1989 in Tiananmen Square. This is a famous picture. This doesn't show, well, it does. You can see this lone young man standing in front of the tanks. It became an iconic image of the democracy movement in China, and of course it's crushing. To the Chinese authorities, democracy had gotten a bad name during Mao's Cultural Revolution, and they associated democracy, as did some of the ancient Greeks, with disorder, with mob rule, with chaos, with the undermining of authority, and they wanted nothing to do with it. Another example of this kind of thing occurred in Algeria in 1992. They were holding elections in a normal fashion, but when an Islamic party seemed on the verge of winning those elections, the military stepped in, canceled the elections, which ushered in about a 10-year civil war in Algeria, from which Algeria is still recovering. Now, democratic retreat is not just an American phenomenon. It is a global phenomenon in the last couple of decades. How has it unfolded? At times, democracies were simply overthrown when the military stepped in and took over. Normally, when the military did this, they did so in the name of law and order. They generally promised that they would return to democratic rule in some time. This has happened in a number of African countries 3, 4, half dozen times in the last 50 years. More often, however, democratic regimes have weakened in various ways as rulers with authoritarian instincts undertook a number of policies. They weakened the independent judiciary, they bypassed legislatures, they politicized prosecutorial powers, they undermined the fairness of elections, co-opted private businesses, attacked universities, and much of this, of course, feels familiar to us. Trump, of course, has been making the president supreme within the executive branch by asserting control over independent agencies of various kinds, and by purging the civil service of anybody who does not pledge loyalty to Trump. He has exerted executive dominance over both the legislative and judicial branches of the government, and has weakened traditional social constraints on presidential power by attacking the media, the universities, punishing opposing lawyers, undermining voting rights, and so forth. All of this, you don't need me to tell you about. I recently came across one interesting, broader analysis of all of this. And the argument that it made was this, that in the last several centuries, progress, continuous improvement, has become the secular religion of Western societies. It began with the Enlightenment, which proclaimed the idea of progress, that it was inevitable and unlimited. And we have generally believed this and believed that every generation should have a better life than the one before. But we are running up against the limits of this kind of progress. There are, of course, environmental limits, as we know from pollution and the loss of so many species of plants and animals. There have been economic limitations, as capitalism does not seem to have developed the ability to have steady progress. There are a lot of ups and downs. You remember the big crash in 2008. There has been considerable economic insecurity in many parts of the Rust Belt, for example, in this country, as a kind of deindustrialization has taken hold and outsourcing of manufacturing to other parts of the world. And in addition to economic loss and environmental loss, there has been cultural loss. In the face of immigration, many white men have felt that they were being made a minority in their own country. In the face of feminism, many men have felt a cultural loss of their masculinity. The attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives has seemed threatening to many people. The aging of the population and our reliance on a smaller next generation has meant that it may not be possible to expect the kind of improvement, the kind of economic improvement and upward mobility that we were led to expect. And all of this, therefore, leads to a loss of confidence in elected governments, in electoral democracy. Some recent polling suggested that 41% of Americans, that only 41% of Americans 18 years of age or older are consistent supporters of democracy. And if that is limited to people 18 to 39, apparently only 25% are solid, persistent backers of democracy. All of this, of course, is amplified by social media as a way to mobilize supporters and gives rise to the kind of political polarization and inability to compromise that we see in many countries these days, leading people to believe that a strong leader is better than this. And so democracy takes a beating. Now, not to end on a wholly negative note about democracy, there have been, in the last few years, a number of resistance movements to democratic backsliding. There has been resistance to this. Poland in 2023, after 8 years of erosion under a right-wing government, a pro-democracy coalition successfully reversed the trend and won elections in 2023. In Brazil, after the 2022 elections in which the loser, Bolsonaro, claimed fraud, Lula was reelected, and Bolsonaro has recently been tried and convicted and imprisoned. In South Korea, you may recall just a year or so ago, President Yoon Suk Yeol declared emergency martial law when he didn't get his way with the parliament, and massive counter demonstrations and action by the Constitutional Court led to his impeachment. Just a few weeks ago, the Netherlands unexpectedly elected a centrist government, which was a big blow to Geert Wilders, who is the leader of the right-wing populist movement in the Netherlands and was widely expected to have won that election and to have formed the next government, but that did not occur. What can one conclude from all of this? Democracy is both persistent and vulnerable. In our country, of course, there is little doubt that democratic retreat or democratic backsliding is in process. The question before us, of course, is whether it can be successfully resisted. So that's democracy then and now, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
I'm interested in your opinion of the role of the protests in this country against what's happening, if they're effective, in your opinion, and or if you have other ways of telling citizens how to protest other than standing on the overpass and stuff.
Are they effective?
Yeah.
It's not obvious that they have been immediately effective.
Mhm.
But this may be one of those things where effectiveness is not the question, but values are. Maybe it is useful to make these kind of protests, even if you're not sure that they're going to be effective.
Good point.
Simply to take a stand, to make your position known. Lots of people have mobilized in support of lost causes. I remember I took a course at the University of Wisconsin. It was taught by a passionate socialist. And I remember a lecture that he gave one time in which he talked about European socialists in the late 19th century. They did not win a lot of victories, but the movement itself brought them together, gave them a kind of high purpose for their lives, established solidarity with other people, and made them happy, even if their actions were not successful.
I would like to say that recent demonstrations, the No Kings, there was no people on freeways. They were not disrupting traffic or anything. You're talking about way back. The recent demonstrations, people have not been stopping traffic, and from what I've seen.
Yeah.
No,
Your overpass.
no, the overpass thing was a while ago.
Yeah.
You mentioned that demonstrations are on overpasses and stopping traffic. The more recent demonstrations have not done that. here locally.
They haven't done what?
They're not stopping traffic.
No, that's true.
That's what I'm trying to
Yeah,
say. They're
yeah.
not doing that. No,
Yeah.
they're in parks, you know, they're
Yeah.
on sidewalks. Sonoma County, they never stop. They're on, you know, they're on the edge of the road.
Yeah.
They're not in the middle of the road.
Yeah.
But I agree with Bob about, what did you call it? People coming together. Feeling that you're not the only one
Yes,
that
yes,
standing
yeah.
up
Yes.
against.
Unifying.
something.
Yes.
Unifying,
Yeah.
yes. I think that's important.
Yes.
Which democracy currently in the world do you feel is working the best? Could you name the number of
I'm
different?
sorry, with that, what
Well,
is,
which democracy in the whole world do you feel like is actually
Oh.
working most ideally right now? Because you pointed out a number of them have been coming to not just us. But I'm just curious if there's one that you feel is actually
well,
working okay right
the
now.
recent election in the Netherlands was very encouraging. The impeachment of the South Korean president was encouraging. That is a democratic victory. So it's, I don't know how all this is going to work out, of course. The future by definition is unknown and unknowable, which makes me happy to be a historian, where I can work with things that we know a little bit about. Although the past is often as unpredictable as the future.
What do you mean?
Yes.
Well, they used to make that joke about history in the Soviet Union, that it changed with every new ruler that came on, and so they said that the past was at least as unpredictable as the future.
Let's keep on writing history.
Yes,
What about Hellenism? People were opposed to the idea of this rational thought of science and things like that. And you know, like theocracies pushing their way and not accepting a rational thinking, or opposed to Hellenism.
well, secularism has been one of the threats to democracy, because people with a religious outlook, at least certain kinds of a religious outlook, mostly sort of fundamentalist or exclusive and highly politicized, that kind of religion is threatened by the emergence of modern science, of secularism.
Diversity.
Yes, yes. And so some of the backlash against that fuels right-wing populism derives from the notion that religion is somehow being diminished, disregarded, not respected. Trump now wants to or has threatened to invade Nigeria because of what he calls Christian genocide. There certainly have been anti-Christian protests and murders. The seizure of young girls, for example, as hostages continues to occur on occasion. But about half of Nigeria is Christian already, mostly in the south. The Muslims are largely in the north. And so it's hard to see that there's any general anti-Christian movement going on.
Can I ask you a question? I watched a show on YouTube the other day about the far right in Germany,
Yeah.
especially is it the AFD?
The AFT, yeah.
Yeah. You-
Well, I don't know a whole lot about them, but it's Germany is one of the places where